Hello and welcome. My name is Susan Cohen, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Alumni Relations at Washington University. I'm excited to welcome you to our second Wednesdays with WashU webinar. Wednesdays with WashU features alumni and parents from around the world. We hope to share inspiring stories with you throughout the summer and into the fall. Before we begin, I'd like to explain the format for today's session. You'll only hear and see me and our presenters. Our presentation will last about 1 hour. Following the interview, we'll have plenty of time for questions. We encourage you to participate by asking questions at any time. To do that, type a question into the Q&A box. Thanks to all of you who have already submitted questions via your registration. During the Q&A, we'll get to as many questions as we can. The webinar is being recorded and we'll share it on the Alumni Association YouTube channel following the event. It is now my pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Peter Baumgarten, who is Professor of Practice, Strategy, and Organizations at the Olin Business School. Dr. Baumgartner is also the Faculty Director for the Center for Experiential Learning at Olin, a university center that runs for-profit and nonprofit student-led strategic consulting engagement, both globally and around the St. Louis region. At WashU, he teaches courses on leadership, organizational design, and strategic management within Olin's MBA, BSBA, Executive MBA, Executive Education, and Brookings Institute programs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Baumgarten.
Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. That was a great way to start to frame my career. I always appreciate the kind words from the university when it comes to our work. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And welcome the person you all are here to see, which is Danny Meyer. So Danny, if you get a chance to open your own screen, Danny, that's a lovely background you've got there. Where are you, by the way, right now?
I'm up in Northwest Connecticut, and I wish I had all these fancy bookshelves that everybody else seems to have as their background, but this is where the computer is, so there we go.
Just got to throw up that green screen and throw a bunch of WashU logos here as well, and maybe you can do that well. So let me just briefly introduce Danny. Most of you are on this call because you know him well already, whether from his writings or his great restaurants in the, I don't even want to say fast casual space. I actually heard you talk about this on Guy Raz's podcast the other day when you called it something different, not fast casual for Shake Shack, but instead
fine casual.
Fine casual. So I had a little fine casual food this last week in preparation for our time here together. He is also the CEO of Union Square Hospitality Group and writers of one of the, I think, creative and one of the best books out there on business and leadership, which is Setting the Table. I think it wrestles with a lot of questions that we in the organization and strategy space need to think more about, which is how do you prioritize various different stakeholders as you deliver value to your organization. So Danny, great to have you here again, and many thanks for joining us on this Wednesdays at WashU.
That's great to see you again. And Thank you all for tuning in.
So Danny, I'm going to hop back in time a little bit. In fact, it was in October of this last year that you and I met for the first time. I remember this because it was a freezing cold day when there was talk of whether or not trick-or-treaters were going to go out for the evening. And we had you over to the business school talking about business of the arts. And so we had a group of local chefs out on the stage in the business school. You were joining us as well. And in some ways that feels like an incredible time ago. From October 31st into today. Since then, 4 months afterwards, we started to see the emergence of a pandemic, a global pandemic that has radically shifted your business operations. Within the last couple months, there's been a greater awareness of some of the underlying racial inequalities and inequities across various different sectors, both out in the world, but also within sectors like restaurants and higher education and the corporate space. So I want to take a step back here for a second and to go to something you said in this podcast that stuck with me. And you said basically that problems are the essence of business. Learning how to solve and address problems are key to being a good business leader. So I'm curious right now, when it comes to your world, what are the problems that are top of mind to you? What are the things that keep you up at night, you and your team are wrestling with at USHG and other places?
Well, let me count the ways. Let me count the problems. And, you know, when you talked about that moment in October, it was a very, very different world. We were talking about a lot of different topics probably than we will be talking about today. And then on the other hand, I think that hospitality and the way you approach problem solving and people is the compass that we need to use when we're in uncharted territory. You know, I often feel like I'll just the headline answer to what you're asking, Peter, about problems that we're facing right now are all problems we've never had before. In my entire career, I never imagined laying off 95% of a company that took almost 35 years to build. I never imagined trying to figure out how to open up restaurants, which are gathering places, which are great for the human spirit and soul, are fantastic employers, and especially in a city that is all about lots and lots of people close together, and then all of a sudden realizing that the very thing we do is the very thing that we shouldn't be doing, which is bringing people together. Mm. And then when you learn that every city and every state is opening in different phases, and there's been quite a stop and start where our industry is now really, as of the last week or so, being seen in some of the states where restaurants started opening to the public much sooner, being connected to a spike in coronavirus cases. And so as goes the industry in Texas and Florida, now we learn so goes the industry in New York, because that's when our governor said, hey, you know, when we told you guys you were going to be opening at 50% capacity, which would have been a problem in and of itself. Well, we were just kind of kidding about that. That's not going to happen for some period of time. So when you talk about problems, how do you decide when to recruit people back or not? And now when we're on the topic of recruiting, where did all those people go after they were laid off? And furthermore, are their unemployment benefits perhaps even greater than what they might earn if they did come back to work? Oh, and just one other thing, if you're in a city where just about 100% of your employee base takes public transportation to come to work, but they don't feel safe being on public transportation, what do you then do? So we're just dealing in this area of so many unknowns, and yet trying to use our compass of hospitality to navigate through the whole thing constantly.
So I love that description of the way in which hospitality can also be a decision-making and problem-solving approach. But I'm curious what it means, right? I can think of hospitality at the level of you and I having a conversation. I can think of hospitality in the context of a restaurant experience. But what does hospitality look like as a decision philosophy or a way of managing your team and organization?
Well, so I define hospitality as something that only exists if the person on the other side of the dialogue feels like you're on their side. That doesn't mean you're always delivering good news, but it means that you're being straight with someone, you're balancing reality and hope. And in our version of hospitality, which we call enlightened hospitality, we created a stakeholder system, which I was actually quite interested to see after you and I spoke last October. The Business Roundtable actually came out and they said, this is our model, the stakeholder model, which is that you create a virtuous cycle where you put your own employees first, you actually put your customers second, your community third, your suppliers fourth, and your investors fifth. And in so doing, our theory goes that you create a virtuous cycle wherein happier employees lead to happier customers, which creates a bigger top line for your business, which allows you to do good things for your community, which means your community is on your side, which means that you can have better products and better service and better pricing even from your suppliers. And at the end of the day, if you're running your business well, you should have more of a bottom line that makes your investors happy. And only when your investors are happy can you do good things for your employees, because you can't give raises and promotions if you're in a steady state situation. So how does that all apply to today? Well, that means that almost every single decision we make has to begin with, what are we doing for our employees first, as we try to, we've got side currents and wind in our face and all kinds of stuff, but we got to keep moving ahead. And the hardest problem that I think we have faced, and it's been more than once, because we've never been exactly sure when this thing was going to end. I believe it will end. I don't believe this is the thing that's going to end the world, but the goalpost keeps getting moved. And so employment itself and who you can afford to keep on your payroll in what was for 3 months a zero revenue condition that we were in was probably the single hardest thing. How do you put your employees first and lay them off at the same time? Really became the most challenging thing that I think we had to confront.
Well, so one of the roles that I didn't mention that you have, which is I know is an important role for you, is the role of a father. And I think in some ways you're a WashU father too, right? So you have a student here that's not on campus, but will be on campus. When it comes to that idea of delivering hard news that you know is in the best interest of the organization, but also hard to deliver on the part of your employee, I'm curious how you see that playing out. So imagine if you're working for me, Danny, and I'm saying that we have to shut down operations. It's the best thing from a public health standpoint. It's required. And I don't know necessarily when we're going to be back in full operations. I know that some organizations might come back before we come back. How do you deal with employees both inside and outside of the business right now with an attitude of hospitality?
By being straight up with people. And it's always been really trying to balance reality and hope. And whether you're a parent or a business person, I think that the context of, look, we have had a really good thing going here and we can't do it right now. That's reality. And it's not safe for you to come to work. And the best thing we can do for you is to not provide a situation where your health is in jeopardy. And keep in mind, at the beginning of this, New York was the epicenter of this virus everywhere in terms of caseload, in terms of mortality. And again, unfortunately, we're not an automobile culture. So none of the two places we know people have felt relatively safe are in their own home and in their automobile. But in New York, what that means is people only felt safe being at home. And that went for employees as well as prospective guests. So what we did in those early days was two things. Number one was we said, we want to have to transition ourselves from being a really good employer to being the best possible unemployer we can be. So the very first thing we did was to set up a 501c3 about as quickly as you can legally do that. And we called it the USHG Hugs Fund. And through a series of, auctions, and we sold gift cards and put 100% of the revenue to this. I gave my compensation to this. We were able to raise over $1.5 million, and we've granted out about 1.3 of those $1 million to team members who are out of work. Why did we do that? Well, because we got to put our people first. We also, every single Thursday afternoon, would host a chat, an hour-long chat with everybody who had once been part of our company but remained part of our family. We also created an amazing intercompany webpage with all kinds of resources for those who had been laid off. It could be training on how to put together a resume. It could be emotional services, which many, many people needed. It could be a jobs board of like-spirited companies who actually were primarily digital and therefore actually doing well during this time, who wanted to recruit some of our people. But then it gets back to every single communication would be a balance of reality and hope. And if the news was bad, like, guys, I'll never forget the call where we had to say, when we thought that we might be able to reopen some of our places by May or by June or by July, it's not going to happen. And so it's probably in your best interest to go look for something else. We hope there will be a time when we can, give you the call and say, we're ready to go, please come back. But it wouldn't be right for us to say that right now. So constantly balancing what's real, but also the sense that there will be a time when we're back. And when we're back, here's the real reality. If we run out of money, we'll never get back to being an employer anyway. And so the best thing we can do is create some stability for those who are laid off as much as we possibly can, while we create, hopefully, financial stability for ourselves so that we can then come back and thrive again.
Yeah, that's a really interesting framing in the sense that you're prioritizing certain stakeholders first, and there's an order of how it delivers financial value. And then at the same point, sometimes you need to really keep your eye on the ball financially, because it might have implications for what you can do from an employment perspective.
Oh, it absolutely will. It absolutely will. And then our second stakeholder is our customer. And so here's an example where the first business we were able to relaunch as a takeout and curbside pickup, the kind of thing you see all over the country right now, is a fine casual restaurant called Daily Provisions. Mm-hmm. And that involved, creating a safe way to get people to come back to work. On day one, we said, look, the only thing you're responsible for, this was for the 5 people who work there, because we shrunk our team down to 5. We said, the only thing you're responsible for on day one is figure out how to get from your apartment to work. Figure out how to open the door in a way that feels safe. And then when you get there, you have 2 jobs, besides wearing a mask.
3 jobs.
And staying 6 feet away from everyone else on the team.
Yeah.
Have a 1-hour conversation and figure out how to make a cup of coffee. When you're done with that, go home. That was day one. And every day after that got a little bit easier. And then we started reaching out to our guest base, and we figured out who our top 100 most loyal guests were based on dollars spent. And we got some of that data from our credit card companies. And each one of those people got an email saying, we're back open, and only within, a hyper local couple of zip codes. And each one of them got an email saying, we're back, we've missed you, and the first one's on the house. Tell us what you'd like and we'll deliver it. We'll have it delivered to you, or you can come pick it up. And, I have a letter right here. I've been hearing emails from people, but someone wrote this tiniest 2-page letter saying how much that meant to them to have just gotten that call, because they didn't know that they were even recognized.
Yeah.
So that's then the next thing is, how do you take care of your community and how do you take care of your suppliers?
Yeah.
And we're finally at the point where we're doing that right now, actually.
Yeah. Well, we're going to come back to rethinking the future of restaurants in a bit, but I'm curious your take on something like the following. There are a number of different forms of inequities in the restaurant industry. And sometimes it's things that you've cared about in terms of front of the house versus back of the house. I know you've spent quite a bit of time talking about racial and gender inequities and how that has kind of spread across various different forms of industries, restaurants being one of the others. Another one that you've talked about is whether or not someone can make a living wage being in this particular industry moving forward. I'm curious, in the midst of this, has COVID-19 highlighted different forms or unearthed different forms inequities than you've thought about in the past? And how do you see USHG or Shake Shack in being part of that solution?
Well, not only has the pandemic really laid bare what's going on, but of course, the protests across the country following the murder of George Floyd really made really raw and important conversations happen. As a matter of fact, one of our all company chats, actually 2 of our all company chats, were specifically about this topic. And look, I think we are not alone as an industry in coming to a place where you go, I cannot unsee what happened. I cannot unhear or unfeel what I have felt. And this has been with us for a long time. And yet, probably because of COVID, possibly because people had been on lockdown for weeks and weeks and weeks before that, and there was a pent-up need to just get out. This was the tinderbox. And I hope that, as painful as this has been for so many people of color and white people, to confront something that has been many people have been aware of, and not that many people, unfortunately, have been aware of so many of the words and expressions and thoughts and feelings that we've heard. I didn't know what it meant to be anti-racist the way I understand that right now. I didn't know what it meant to be an ally or not the way I understand that right now. And that's just for beginners. I didn't know what it meant to be performative or authentic in this particular capacity. So for all those reasons, we have to look as an industry. I have to look. I can't be responsible for our whole industry, but I am responsible for our company. And this is happening at Shake. You asked about Shake Shack, where I'm the chairman of the board, but I've got to say that the CEO of Shake Shack and that entire team have really provided incredibly solid and clear leadership, which is something that consumer companies did not used to do. We used to get all of that from political places or policymakers. And today, it is very, very evident that your business has to take a stand, or you will not have the kind of allegiance from your own employees, never mind allegiance from your customer base. And at the risk of potentially not making some of your customer base happy, and at the risk of potentially not making some of your employee base happy,
yep,
today's leaders absolutely have to take a stand. So now, getting to your point, when we eliminated tipping beginning back in 2015, it was because of a growing concern I had of the role that the tipping system was playing in the increasing inequity of how people can get paid in the restaurant industry. We know that there's a sub-minimum wage that is paid to tipped employees across the country. In at least half the states, it is still $2.13 an hour. And what that means is that the tipped employees in those states, especially if they're not working in fancy, expensive restaurants, are basically working at the behest of whoever their restaurant table is filled with. And it could be someone who's racist, who says, I'm not going to give you as big of a tip because you don't look like the kind of person I want to give us, or I'm going to give you a bigger tip because you do look like the kind of person I want to take care of. That's just not right. It's also not right when you understand that it's not legal to share tips between the dining room and the kitchen. And when you then learn, furthermore, that across the country, 60% of all kitchen workers are people of color, may not legally share in tips as of now, and 60% of dining room employees are white who may make tips. And the tipping population continues to make more money over the years because every time menu prices go up, their tip, which is a percentage of that, goes up. And meanwhile, the back of the house has remained flat. So now we're looking at new ways of trying to address that. And you led a very fantastic study amongst some of your students at Washington University, which is really helping us to think about the next step in the evolution to make how people are paid not only more equitable for people, but how to make sure that the way we pay people does not perpetuate some of the underlying racism that exists, and sexism, I have to say as well, that exists in our industry.
Well, Danny, one of the things that I've always appreciated about how you've both written about leadership and then the brief times we've interacted is the way in which you do a really good job of keeping your eye on the fundamentals and realizing that the way they get translated into a new space might evolve. So hospitality in a takeout, carry out sort of model is going to look different. We think about this quite a bit in terms of education. We at WashU care deeply about hospitality, but the way that it looks in the fall might look different than the way that it looked in the fall of 2019. And so there's an ability to keep your eye on the principal ball and be informed by the data that speaks to those various different components over time. So to that point, I'm actually curious a bit about how you're thinking about the future of restaurants. I have been struck in a number of different interviews when you've talked about this pullback from a large number of employees at USHG at full capacity to a significantly smaller population right now, and how many of those individuals right now are being tasked with thinking about innovating and evolving the future of your core businesses. Can you talk a little bit both about the process, about how you create this innovation engine inside USHG, and maybe even a few ideas of things that are being addressed that you might be especially excited about?
We've been taking, the best way I can describe it is a throw the spaghetti against the wall and see which strand sticks approach. Every one of our businesses is trying something, and a lot of it's not working. And that's kind of like life, but you got to keep trying. So, and the problem is that a lot of the times if something's not working, we don't know whether it's because, the classic three things: product, price, and promotion. We don't know if we got the product wrong or the price wrong, or we didn't promote it. Or it could just be that no one's in New York right now.
Yep.
There's been a pretty big diaspora of people who have left the city. So you're starting to see in New York, a lot of restaurants are trying to deliver, let's say, to the Hamptons, because the common belief is that's where all of our customers are. Well, we tried that over 4th of July weekend with one of our businesses, and we put together these packages of, I think our thinking at the time was that everybody wanted to reduce the amount of time in their kitchen, reduce the number of times they have to leave the house. And so you were going to get your dinner and your breakfast and your lunch with instructions for how to turn last night's dinner into tomorrow's lunch. And we got it wrong. Guess how many we sold in the whole Hamptons? We sold, I think, 12 of these packages. And meanwhile, so with that business, you just got to say, okay, is it because it was the first time we tried it? Or is it, and therefore no one knew? Is it because everybody in New York City is trying to deliver to the Hamptons? Or maybe we should just stick to our knitting and focus on the crowd that's in New York. So now we're trying to get more and more data. And again, working with some of our friends at some of the credit card companies who know exactly who's spending what when in the city, and trying to use some of that data to figure out what are the right hours we should be open and what's the right menu mix, because we don't have the confidence right now to just go hire a whole new staff until we know that we've got something. Now, some of our restaurants have found things that have worked. So Gramercy Tavern, which is, it's a Michelin-starred restaurant. Guess what? Gramercy Tavern's selling like crazy right now, right out the door. Hamburgers, right off the grill, competing with Shake Shack. And
same price point or higher price point, Danny?
Oh, much higher price point. But of course, it's butchered in-house and grilled over wood. But, Gramercy Tavern's also selling lobster rolls. And what we've learned there is that the restaurant, even though it's well known for tasting menus and special occasions in many cases, the trust that exists for whatever comes out of that kitchen is translating into a product that people actually feel like eating right now. And so that one's actually working quite well. We're selling pizza from Marta. We're selling barbecue from Blue Smoke. The business that's probably doing the best of all, besides Daily Provisions, is a taco stand we have called Tacocina. And why is that? Well, because Tacocina is a standalone stand in a park and it's safe. People feel safe going to a park, and they don't have to go. It's not giving up a dining room because there was never a dining room in the first place.
Mm.
So we're just trying almost everything. I think the thing that I'm really excited about, which is just starting this week, is a program called Rethink. And we got some sponsorship from a fantastic company called Brookfield Properties. I'm sure they're in St. Louis. And Brookfield sponsored us to activate 3 of our kitchens so that we could hire some people back. And the goal is to produce 125,000 meals, which will be delivered by this organization called Rethink to various places in the South Bronx. So that's what I call a quadruple win, because for the first time in ages, we get to buy product from our suppliers, we get to hire cooks, activate our kitchens, and even though we can't welcome guests into our restaurants, we can at least feel like we're doing something for the community. In fact, we are doing something for the community.
Fantastic. So one mechanistic mechanics question about the innovation, just because I'm curious in this space, and I think it might be relevant for the group that's on the call. It sounds like some of the testing, the throwing spaghetti at the wall, is based on seeing what actual consumers respond to. So in other words, do they order it in the Hamptons? But another piece of it, I would imagine, has to be vetted before you actually go out to market. For a while, because you weren't in market, right? You were in delay, you were in pause. What's the process by which you get a team of people towards an appropriate or insightful vetting of ideas before you go out there? Or do you just say, let's make a bunch of spaghetti and throw?
Well, we have 4 family values at Union Square Hospitality Group: hospitality, excellence, entrepreneurial spirit, and integrity. So one of our 4, we only have 4 values. Those are the only 4 things we stand for: doing something as well as we can, doing it in a way that makes other people feel better, coming up with fresh ways of thinking about something that everybody else only wishes they had thought of first, and doing it with integrity, having the judgment to do the right thing, even when it doesn't seem like it's in your own self-interest. So those are our guiding principles, but entrepreneurial spirit is something that is your job if you work in our company. So every single one of the teams that is still working for us, associated with every individual business, has been responsible within a framework of creating their own entrepreneurial map for what to do next. We debate it. I'm part of these conversations, and we try. And the other thing, Peter, that I've just never seen to this extent in my entire career is the degree to which restaurants unrelated to one another are learning from one another. So in New York City, there's 26,000 restaurants. It's a pretty competitive set.
Yep.
And a lot of restaurateurs, including me, have a reasonably proud and stubborn personality, which says, we're going to figure this thing out first. And that's why you're going to prefer to come to our restaurant. Well, what's happening right now is that everybody is stymied right now. And everybody's talking and everybody's trying to learn from each other. So every idea we come up with could actually be derivative of an idea that we've seen work in some other business. I cannot tell you how many times on a daily basis one of us forwards a marketing email from another business with another idea that maybe we had not thought of. And I'm sure they're doing that with our emails as well.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a good thing to see our industry talking to one another. We're talking not only about ideas to recover, but we're also talking about a lot of policy ideas at the same time. Because here's what I would say about COVID. One of my colleagues said something to me that I wish I could come up with a better way of saying it. I'm not taking credit, but I'm going to repeat it. And he said the restaurant industry itself is like an 85-year-old with pre-existing conditions who just got COVID.
Oof.
And it wasn't going to necessarily take COVID to knock that 85-year-old to their knees. But COVID certainly has. And our industry has so many underlying structural issues. The way we pay people is certainly one of them. The way we negotiate our leases is certainly one of them. so many different aspects. And so what this is doing, which is great actually, is restaurant colleagues across companies are speaking with each other more than I've ever seen, and trying to come up with ways to say, look, when this is done, what will we have done so that we can't be in a position to have laid off millions and millions and millions of people ever again.
That's great. So we're going to transition shortly to some questions that are coming in, both that have been written in, as well as those that are coming in on the chat itself. Anytime you've got 200 plus people on the line, I promise you, I wish we could answer every single one of your question, but we have to be somewhat filtered. But I'll hit one that I was thinking about as well. I know you've talked about a bit, but it came up among several people that submitted. And it was about this process of thinking about the PPP money. And I know you've talked about it at several points, but it was interesting even yesterday in the news to see the full data come out of what organizations have taken the money, what haven't, who have returned, so on and so forth. And I'm curious, when it comes to Shake Shack, where you're the chairman of the board, how the team collectively went about that discernment process, both on the front end, the initial choice, as well as the decision to return the PPP money.
So yeah, it's very straightforward. When this thing hit, this pandemic, and restaurants were closing left and right, and by the way, Shake Shack just yesterday submitted or disclosed that the sales for the last period, comp store sales were down 58%.
Yep.
All right, and that's an improvement over where things were at the end of March when the government announced its payroll protection plan. So Shake Shack did what many, many businesses have done, and laid off a responsible number of people. When I say responsible number of people, many, many fewer percentage-wise than in a full-service business like Union Square Hospitality Group, because Shake Shack was able to pivot with its model to become a curbside pickup kind of business, even though it couldn't welcome guests. So in that environment, and with a stock price plunging at that moment, and the government announcing a plan to help businesses stay on their feet and be able to reemploy people, and Shake Shack learning that, yep, it qualifies under the rules of the government program, Shake Shack did what I believe was the responsible thing, which was to apply for the loan. Mm-hmm. The loan was approved. The day that Shake Shack, as a public company, disclosed that its $10 million loan was approved, happened to be exactly the same time when the government said, oops, we didn't fund the payroll protection plan to the degree that we should have. And as a result of that, all of these applications, many of which are from much smaller companies than Shake Shack, cannot be fulfilled. This was back at the end of March. That was on a Friday, if I'm not mistaken. Or that was on a Thursday. On the Friday, the board approved going to the public markets to raise capital by selling off some of the company's stock, which happened. And there became an outcry, quite understandably, from many, many small businesses across the country who had applied for the loans, had not gotten them because the government had run out of money. And it wasn't clear that the plan would be, resupplied with money, which again, it has been twice, I think, since that point, but it wasn't clear. And so Shake Shack was in the position of going, we have another way of raising money in the public markets. It's not right that people got shut out who are much smaller. And so on that weekend, that very weekend, the board said, we're going to give it back. And it was a really, it was obviously the right decision to give it back at that point. I believe it was the right decision to apply in the first place. And I think the outrage should have been towards the government. But on the other hand, being somebody who understands that there's never fewer than two sides to every story, to its credit, the first CARES Act, which included the PPP plan, was about the first time in ages that I had seen a bipartisan solution come together quickly.
Like that, amazing speed.
And so you can't on one hand say that's a great thing, and then on the other hand expect it not to have had flaws.
Yep.
And it had actually way more flaws for our industry, because in the restaurant industry, those loans, which are loans, they're not handouts, would only be forgiven if you hired back your team, 75% of your team, by the end of June, which couldn't happen because we couldn't even be in business.
Yep.
So there were many, many flaws to it. And, you know, it's interesting because the PPP is back in the news because it was the loans, I think 2 days ago or so, above a certain threshold were announced. And so it's back in the news again. One thing I want to say though, I don't think it should be a scarlet letter on a company for having applied for a loan in a program that was designed to help companies stabilize so they could hire people back.
Yep.
I think that, again, if your company, and I think public companies have a public currency, have an alternative means of creating a stability so that they can remain in business, that made sense to us. And that's why we were the first public company. Shake Shack was the first public company to return the loans, and many, many others, including some institutions, quite apart from public companies. I know on the East Coast, some of the Ivy League schools were faced with this same dilemma, and they followed suit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good description, because I think there's a number of different dimensions that go into that discernment. One piece is there a need? And as you just described, in many businesses, Shake Shack being one of them, if your revenue drops 50, 60%, there's a need. And then there's this question of opportunities for access elsewhere. And what many people don't realize in that discernment process is, because it was so quick from a policy standpoint, at least many businesses that I talked to had to make real quick decisions over the course of a weekend, over the course of a week, what to do. Very difficult decision to do on the part of companies as they're discerning their own risk over time.
And there was also a window at the beginning where you said, you know, the ship is sinking, the government's throwing out lifelines. It would have been, I'm telling you, the bigger the company, the more employees you have.
Yeah.
So if you are an employee first company, and no one in the government at the beginning said, and by the way, if you don't get in line tomorrow, we're going to run out of funds on March 27th.
Yeah.
So I think it was the right thing to have applied. And then it was also the right thing to give it back.
Well, Danny, I appreciate your willingness to hop into the decision logic on that, because I do think it's easy to view any organization from the outside and to not see inside the engine of how these choices are actually made. So much appreciated there. I want to go to a couple other questions that are dealing with what's going to stick in this new normal. And so again, I'm cobbling together some questions here, but for example, takeout is a good example of something that's ramped up across the industry. I know for several businesses that I've spent some time with and talked to their restaurateurs, many of whom were on the same stage with us last October, there's this question of what do they do in takeout, whether it's going to cannibalize their core business, whether it's going to stay long-term over time or not. I'm curious how you think about that innovation. Have we seen a new normal for the structure of restaurants that's required in a less dense environment?
Yeah, I think we are. I think that once restaurants develop a muscle for using their kitchen to provide meals that will be consumed outside of the four walls of their restaurant, they're not going to want to lose that. They're not going to want to lose that muscle. I think the biggest, and by the way, there's many ways to do it. There's curbside pickup, there is delivery, and there's also overnight delivery across the country. Mm-hmm. We invested in a company called Goldbelly, whose revenues are about 7 times today what they were in March. And Goldbelly is not delivering a mile away from the restaurant. They're delivering your favorite barbecue from St. Louis across the country, or your favorite ice cream from St. Louis across the country. In our case, we're selling barbecue, pizza, we're selling egg sandwiches, we're selling Shack burgers, where you can have that delivered. You may not have a Shake Shack in Wichita, but you may want the experience. So that's a new model that doesn't take any more people and it doesn't take any more real estate, you're going to see a lot of that. I think if there's one big concern that restaurants should have, it's that the aggregator delivery companies, where there were 6 a year ago, none of whom were making money.
Yep. There
are now about 3 big ones right now. Uber just bought Postmates, DoorDash bought Caviar, and I can't even think of the other one right now. Oh, Grubhub just got bought by a company from Europe. So there's now 3. And just like the airline industry and the hotel industry actually found that if they were not doing their own bookings, they were not going to have any of their own customer data, and their margins were just going to get lower and lower and lower. If restaurants are going to depend upon outside delivery companies to do their delivery, I think it's going to be like boiling a frog. I really do, because we're not going to own our data. The companies are going to continue to charge more money because they have to, because they're not making money.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the consumer is not going to probably want to pay more money. Consumer right now is getting a great deal on home delivery of food. Yep. They're not paying what it actually costs.
Yep.
The restaurants are paying too much while the delivery company is not making money. And what that means is the consumer is obviously getting an amazing deal. If the consumer stays firm and says, I'm not going to pay more for having your food delivered, and every other restaurant is delivering except you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So this is the area that I think restaurants are going to have to be careful about. And I'm starting to hear some chatter in our industry amongst industry leaders about trying to create a collective where restaurants create their own delivery company.
Interesting. Almost like a co-op structure to some degree, but tied to the delivery space.
But we'll see.
Well, there are a couple other questions as well that hit about issues outside the restaurant space and more about, let's imagine, food for our nation's poor. There's issues of access, there's issues of quality, there's food deserts all around this country from St. Louis to New York and beyond. As a person who's an influencer and a central voice in this space, I wonder how you're thinking about ways in which you as an individual can get involved in that work, how you might even encourage the 220 people on this call to think about that in their own day-to-day lives as well.
Well, I think that's a really important question. And that's one of the reasons that we're engaging with Rethink right now. For years and years, I've been on the board of Share Our Strength and No Kid Hungry, which is trying to get at the root of where childhood hunger leads to a lot of cycles of poverty thereafter, including not being able to learn as well in school, et cetera. And we've been doing a lot to try to advocate to use existing government programs, not creating new ones, but using existing government programs for feeding kids in school. Now, with no school, not only during the summertime, but who knows what's going to happen after that across the country, feeding there becomes a big challenge as well. So we're looking for ways to have mobile feeding units in what you would call a food desert. But the program I was just describing with Rethink, the reason that we, along with Brookfield, were incredibly interested was not just to activate our kitchens and re-employ people, but when we understood that the food would be directed to a neighborhood in the South Bronx that is a food desert, 125,000 meals, and that furthermore, this would not just be a temporary thing. This is something where our company can remain involved. We have kitchens, we have workers. If you can get public-private partnerships to feed people where they need it, that's a really, really good thing. Furthermore, part of this program involves our connecting with quote unquote sister restaurants in the South Bronx, owned by people who live in the South Bronx, where we will be able, especially right now where our team doesn't have a whole lot to do because our restaurants are not open. We have a 36-page reopening safety protocol manual that everyone on our team is required to take. We're going to use that and teach that to our sister restaurants in the Bronx. We're also going to talk to them about purchasing protocol where they can hopefully lower their cost based on things that we've learned. So look, what can we do for our industries? Hopefully set an example that you can come up with a way that is sustainable to do something that is the right thing to do. And when other people see that, hopefully they want to emulate it.
Yeah. So there's a couple other questions left here about both food innovation that I want to hit on, and then also a question around St. Louis as well. But when it comes to food innovation, there's questions around vegan options, the Impossible Burger, other sorts of trends in this space. Are there any trends that you're especially excited about? I know you play in the investment world as well, and you obviously are close to the kitchen in terms of seeing what are the hot trends that are in that area. But how do you think about the future of food and what might or might not work in this new reality?
There's absolutely no question that vegetables are here to stay. I think the question a lot of restaurants are grappling with is, do you make vegetables taste better, or do you make laboratory taste like meat?
Mm.
And, there's absolutely no question that companies like Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat have had lots and lots of success in the marketplace. And that is one direction you can take. I will tell you that Shake Shack, which sells more burgers than any other business that I'm involved with by a lot, is taking a position, which is they want a veggie burger that is craveable and that is vegetables, that's trying to taste like vegetables, that's not trying to be something manufactured that could be plant protein based, but that's trying to pretend it's meat.
Mm.
So we're taking a position that we just want to celebrate vegetables. And we are now testing in a couple of our restaurants an amazing, I think, a craveable vegan burger. For years and years, we've had an all vegetable burger called the Shroom Burger, which remains one of our top selling items, but it's not vegan. And I have no question at all that as we go on in time, people are going to be eating more vegetables and less meat protein. There's just no question about it. And from an investor standpoint, I think it's really worth watching that space. It's also true that technology is now able to make things look and smell and feel like meat that are not actually meat. And it's worth watching that. It's not a bad thing. I don't think it hasn't been proven that it's dangerous to eat something just because it came out of a laboratory. But I just remain a vegetable lover, and I don't see a reason to pretend vegetables aren't vegetables.
Yeah, it's a good example of what you talked about earlier, which is this need to make bets about the future, right? To make a guess. Sometimes you're throwing spaghetti at the wall, you're seeing what sticks. Other time you're saying this particular strand of spaghetti I'm more committed to, or I think it's going to work better. And so you got to make some calls in an uncertain future. So good description of that. So Danny, I got a question about St. Louis, and that might take us to the end, though there might be one about higher ed that I'll slip in as well. But when I think about the Danny Meyer secret sauce, if I were to describe it from the outside, one piece of it is that you're incredibly gifted at storytelling, realizing the power of story. So whether it's realizing the power of early reviews of some of your restaurants to cascade the success of your particular
or not
ventures, or not. I think of, for example, the way that you've talked about the success of Shake Shack in 2002 when people were hungry post 9/11 for something different and coming back to an area, even when you've talked about snowball fights in areas where the first Shake Shack was based. You seem to have an acute ability to identify narrative and story and build upon it, grow ventures and shape cities and city parks through that particular gift. I'm curious how you think about the story of St. Louis. So here you are as a St. Louis native who moved away and comes back sometimes in visits and Zoom calls. But there's a certain kind of deep power of the story of St. Louis, the way that we talk about 1904 and the World's Fair and the Olympics. But it's also a story to some degree of industrial decline, of various different larger companies exiting over the 70s, 80s, 90s until today. So I'm wondering how you think, as an outsider, but a person who has roots here, how you think about the current story of St. Louis and whether or not there might be ways to participate in the revitalization of this particular urban core. It's central to our chancellor. It's central to the strategy of being Washington University for St. Louis and not merely in St. Louis. How do you think about that particular approach and what we can do as many people who are based here in trying to participate in the development of the city?
Well, we could have spent our entire hour on that
We're
very
gonna go
question.
from 1 to 2 o'clock now. Extend the call. Just
No,
kidding.
that's a really it's such an important question, and I remain a St. Louisan through and through. 2 nights ago, I had so much fun rewatching Game 6 of the 2011 World Series, which was broadcast on TV. I don't think I'll ever see a better game than that. Look, it is such a complicated story. St. Louis, the St. Louis I grew up in is very connected to the St. Louis of today. We just weren't as aware. We weren't as aware. I wasn't as aware. Perhaps I should have been, of the segregation.
Yep.
I was aware of a city that was nice and it was about hospitality. My life was my education, my connection with the Blues and the Cardinals and the football Cardinals and Steak and Shake and Ted Drew's and Tony's and all the, Straub's, all the nice places we used to get to go all the time. Ice skating in Shaw Park and going to the zoo, the planetarium, the Fox Theater, Kiel Opera House. What could be better? And yet we now see that the city that was built with so much money was built on perhaps a flawed foundation, where I now know that the city was cleaving in terms of its racial foundation, its whole economic foundation, its manufacturing foundation. And as you just said, so many of the companies that I was so proud, I would tell friends, I'm from the city that has McDonnell Douglas and Anheuser-Busch and Ralston Purina and 7-Up and, on and on and on. I could keep naming them. Emerson Electric. And how many of those businesses are still there as that business? Yeah. So it's sad. And, when I saw the story last week that took place in near the Central West End, it was like, it didn't shock me at all, but it deeply, deeply saddened me. Now, what can I do? I have been and will continue to be an amazing cheerleader for people in my industry. I think that the culinary landscape and the role that St. Louis's restaurant community is playing in a very, very uplifting, good way. Let's leave COVID aside, please. And let's put it behind us, please, for this conversation. The community of St. Louis restaurateurs is second to none in this country in terms of their heart, their passion, and I think their talent as well. So what I can do right now, and what I do and will do, is be a cheerleader for those businesses. I'm so proud of them, and I love them. What I can also do is hopefully engender enough continuing support from the St. Louis community that we can continue to grow Shake Shack, which is a very, very diverse employer, and try to just keep doing as many good things for the community as I can via that. I don't have any intention of opening a fine dining restaurant or full service restaurant in St. Louis. There's plenty of people doing that right now, but I'm connected. I always want to be connected, and I always want to care, and I always will.
Yeah. Well, we're going to kick it over to Susan right now to close us off. But Danny, from my end, many thanks for your continued investment in this university, this place, this city. Always a pleasure to spend some time with you. And Susan, I think you have the last word with us here today.
I do. Thank you so much, Danny. My thanks as well for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. We hope to see you on campus one day soon. And Peter, thank you so much for stepping in to interview Danny. We really appreciate your time as well. To all of you who joined us either on the live stream or via YouTube, thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoy today's program. We look forward to seeing you at future events as well. If you have suggestions for speakers, please feel free to email us at alumniassociation@woostel.edu. And then also visit our digital resources and virtual connections page for continued updates on other events. And that closes our program today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.